Hi, welcome. Today, I want to discuss four myths surrounding the USSR collapse. And the reason for that is that the USSR collapse is shrouded in so much propaganda and disinformation, and there is a lot of popular myths floating around. And I want to sort of set the record straight. The first myth, it happened because of the inherent problems with the communist system. Attributing the Soviet collapse solely to inherent problems of communism is a reductive oversimplification. This perspective ignores that the system demonstrated remarkable resilience during existential crises such as World War II, a conflict that cost the USSR an estimated 27 million lives and maintained superpower status for decades. The causes were multifaceted, but the core issue was structural: the USSR's failure to resolve its balance of payment problems. Crucially, even as the crisis deepened in the late 1980s, the dominant view, both within and outside the USSR, was that these challenges could be addressed through systemic reforms, not that the system was inherently doomed. Data shows that from the 1950s through the early 1980s, the Soviet state budget consistently maintained a surplus. The collapse was triggered by specific policy failures under Gorbachev, not by deterministic inherent flaws. As Harvard historian Sergei Polohy demonstrates, through archival research, the Soviet collapse arose far more due to internal union dynamics than American foreign policy. The system worked well enough during high mobilization scenarios. It was the specific sequencing of perestroika reforms, loosening price controls without establishing market mechanisms, that accidentally destroyed the state's cohesion. The second myth, the 1991 coup bears the burden of the collapse. This is another myth that I see people branding about online. This position implies that Gorbachev had a viable chance to succeed with his reforms, and that the August 1991 coup alone derailed that trajectory. The truth is far more nuanced. No one knows exactly what Gorbachev's proposed loose confederation of independent states would have looked like. Contemporary records suggest that even Gorbachev himself was uncertain about its final nature. The scheduled signing of the new Union Treaty on August 20th, 1991, which would have transformed the USSR into a confederation, proves that Gorbachev had already considered the death of the centralized state by the summer of 1991. By 1991, Gorbachev's actions and inactions had already enabled the partial cannibalization of the Soviet state. The coup did not cause the collapse. It merely provided the perfect legal excuse for the constituent republics to exit. Following the coup's collapse on August 21, the pace of dissolution was stunning. Belarus declared independence on August 25, Moldova on August 27, and Ukraine voted for independence on December 1st. The Ukrainian referendum delivered the fatal blow. Of 37.5 million eligible voters, 83 participated, and approximately 90% voted in favor of full independence. This result, and I quote, nixed all hopes for both a revived Soviet Union as well as a Slavic Union, unquote. A week later, on December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine met at a hunting estate in western Belarus to dissolve the Soviet system, leaving only the vague Commonwealth of Independent States in its wake. Third myth, Western pressures led to the collapse of communism. Now, as a global superpower, neither USSR nor the USA could be collapsed solely by external pressure. Dissolution must be explained primarily by internal factors. The Cambridge history of Cold War confirms this definitively. I quote, "The demise of the Soviet Union was overwhelmingly the result of domestic factors. In the liberal climate of perestroika, ethnic nationalist movements flourished and provided effective vehicle for Republican elites who were looking to gain power at the expense of a Kremlin weakened by mounting economic troubles. The unraveling lay in the USSR's failure to reform in time, followed by a rushed implementation when reforms finally arrived. Between 1990 and 1991, the Soviet retail prices increased by a whopping 140%, and GDP declined 17% in 1991 alone at an accelerating rate. By 1989, the average monthly deficit reached 73 rubles, compared to 18 billion rubles from 1981 to 1985. And by 1990, the government had virtually lost control over economic conditions. Perestroika's fatal flaw was that, I quote, "administrative levers were turned off and economic ones were not turned on. They destroyed the old and did not form a new one." And unquote. The reforms destroyed the ideological framework, divided the support base, and created the conditions for newly minted capitalists and national fronts to cannibalize the remnants of the state. Myth number 4. Soviets could not keep up with the military might of the US. Direct statistical comparison of planes and tanks are unproductive here. Superpowers use weapon systems differently, not bashing them together like action figures. The US could outspend the Soviet military industrial complex handily. NATO spent approximately 270 billion on defense in 1981 alone. However, the Soviet military industrial complex was remarkably cost effective. According to UK Parliament documents, the USSR spent an estimated 12 to 14% of its GNP on defense in 1980, approximately 81 to 86 billion rubles, compared to the US spending about 4.5% of GDP. In per capita terms, US defense expenditure per head was $362 in 1980, while the USSR's was 300 to 320 rubles, though official exchange rates do not adequately reflect the purchasing power. More importantly, the Soviets did not just keep up in nuclear terms, they surpassed the US. According to the Russian Ministry of Atomic Energy data, the Soviet nuclear stockpile peaked at 1986 at 45,000 warheads, compared to the US arsenal of roughly 23,000. The Soviet land army posed the primary conventional threat to Europe, with an estimated 60,000 tanks versus NATO's 20,000. The USSR didn't fail because it couldn't build weapons. It failed because Gorbachev chose to unilaterally concede. The military sector was so productive that it remained Gorbachev's crown jewel. He desperately tried to replicate that efficiency in the civilian sector, but failed. By 1991, the economy was in a free fall, but this was due to the collapse of central planning under perestroika, not military inferiority. Hope I was able to clear some doubts about the collapse of the USSR. There is a lot of misinformation to dig through, and it's important to keep an open mind when researching and learning about highly polarized events like this. Thank you.